Okay, we're moving on to something else, a total new thing today. But before we do, I wanted to show you this. Let me bring it down so you can see it a little better. One of my students made this for me a few years ago, okay? And I don't know if you can read it, um, but let me tell you what it is, because obviously you know that Young Goodman Brown's one of my favorite stories. And so one of my students took a key area out of Young Goodman Brown and made this plaque for me, okay? And it says, had Goodman Brown fallen asleep in the forest and only dreamed a wild dream of a witch meeting? Be it so, if you will, but alas, it was a dream of evil omen for young Goodman Brown, a stern, a sad, a darkly motivated, etc. So it's from obviously young Goodman Brown, and this student obviously enjoyed that a great deal, and so took the time to make that for me, which was really kind of cool. Okay. Oh, now it's crooked. My wife wouldn't like that at all. And I guess we're killing time here. Sorry about that. I guess I'll put it back later. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time on short stories. We've touched a lot of things with short stories. Okay, you folks have done a really nice job with short stories, and I feel like you've learned a lot with short stories. And so it's time to move on. As much as I'd love to spend a whole semester on short stories, this isn't just introduction to short story, it's introduction to literature. And we've looked at a ton of the elements of literature. And so, we've discussed an awful lot of that. Okay, by the way, some of you are still a little bit behind. You have to catch up, okay? You have to catch up. Now, there was nobody who had a failing grade at midterm, maybe because some of you had said to me, yes, I'm going to get this done. Yes, I'm going to get this done. And so I was taking you at your word that you're going to get this stuff done, okay? But anyway, I need you to catch up. Now, some of you may have done some catching up during the Easter break. I don't know, because Trocare's system did a reorganization, and it wiped me off. So I couldn't get in to see what work you had done. So if you did do work, I don't know that. If you didn't do work to catch up, then please get back to it. And again, if you're running into problems, then talk to me, okay? So I can get you back on track, so that, because we only have 4 weeks left, I think. Maybe 5. I don't know. But anyway, we want to get you back on track, okay? Because, we've come too far now. You're more than 2/3 of the way through the semester. So let's finish this with good grades, okay? Okay. So, and there is a final that shows on there, and I'll tell you, you're not going to be taking a final, okay? At least I'm not planning one now, unless people need it to accumulate more points, but I'm not planning on a final. Okay, so enough of the housekeeping stuff. We're moving on to poetry, and don't moan, okay? Don't moan. We don't go into rhyme and meter and iambic pentameter and all that kind of stuff. I don't feel like that's terribly important for what we do in this course. If we were doing a poetry course, then I'd say yes, that's stuff we look at. But an introduction to literature, I just want to introduce you to poetry and help you move past any preconceived fears you have of poetry, okay? So we're not going to delve into all of that scientific kind of stuff. We're just going to talk about some poems and give you a chance to write about some poems. A little background on poetry, okay? Why does poetry exist? And this is pretty important. Back in medieval days and pre-medieval days, there were traveling, they called them minstrels, M-I-N-S-T-R-E-L, minstrels, who moved from castle to castle to castle. And we took a boat ride on the Rhine River one time, and it's like every quarter mile there's another castle. Okay, well these minstrels were like traveling entertainers, and they would go into a castle or a domicile, wherever the person in charge lived, and they would tell stories in the evenings. But the way they would remember the stories is that they would have them written in a rhyming pattern. Now you think about it, you have never forgotten the nursery rhymes you learned as a kid because they rhyme, they rhyme, they rhyme. You know the lyrics to a lot of songs because they rhyme. Okay? Well, poetry actually was originally written, developed to rhyme like that and to have a melodic kind of pattern to it, as in melody, music, to help the minstrels, the entertainers, remember these stories. So they would travel from castle to castle and spend a bunch of evenings relating their stories that were all made into poems, rhyming, so that the minstrels, the entertainers, could remember them, and of course the people listening to them could remember them better that way too. Okay, so that's really where poetry comes from. So that's a little bit of history on poetry. Okay, we're basically going to look at two kinds of poetry, and this is your video question for the week. We're only looking at one kind this week, but we're going to look at two kinds of poetry. There is narrative poetry and there is lyric poetry. Narrative poetry is what we're going to talk about now this week. Narrative poetry tells a story. It narrates, okay? It tells a story. So narrative, story. That's the kind of poems we're going to be looking at this week. The other kind of poem is called a lyric poem. And lyric poems really are pretty much designed to move our emotions, to get inside us and make us a little bit emotional, make us a little more human, make us relate to other people and other people's life occurrences in a little bit better way. So we have two kinds of poetry that we're going to be talking about: narrative and lyric, Lyric. So that's your video question. Obviously, it's worth 10 points, so it's a cheap 10 points. So when you text me, text me the answer to the video question, lyric and narrative. Now, a little key on reading any poetry, okay? Normally, when we read prose, so that like all the short stories we just read, we read them by the punctuation, okay? You get a sentence, there's a period that ends it, then another sentence starts, okay? Or if there's a comma, we pause a little bit there. Do the same thing with poetry. Poetry can be very confusing to us if we just read it line by line by line by line. But a lot of times the thought process in a poem goes beyond a line and into the next line, and then halfway through the next line you'll have a comma, which gives you a pause, okay? So when you read poetry, first of all, don't be afraid of it. And secondly, read it by the punctuation, okay? Read poetry by the punctuation. So read it, in a sense, almost the same as prose, okay? I say almost the same because poetry just kind of has a melodic way to it, and so it creates that certain melody kind of thing in us, okay? So that moves us a little bit away from just reading by the punctuation, but principally in English we write thoughts by punctuation. So read it by the punctuation, okay? So why am I dressed like this? Well, come on. We've talked about setting a bunch of times. Clothing can also be a part of setting. Now, we didn't really include that with setting when we talked about it, but clothing can also be a part of setting, okay? So I am going to recite for you, first of all, one of my favorite poems, and it is a baseball story. So I have a baseball shirt on, and it's baseball season. It started week before, almost, yeah, we're 10 days into baseball season now. So, that kind of fits. But anyway, so I have a baseball shirt on. My son lives in Oakland, and this is a shirt and hat from the Oakland Athletics. Okay. That's why I have this shirt on. But anyway, I want to share with you one of my favorite poems, and the name of the poem is Casey at the Bat. Okay, and I like to have a little bit of fun with this. So the poem goes like this: The outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville Nine that day. The score stood 4-2 with but one inning more to play. And so when Cooney died at first and Burroughs did the same, a sickly silence fell upon the patrons of the game. A straggling few got up to go in deep despair. The rest clung to the hope that springs eternal in the human breast. They thought if only Casey could but get a whack at that, they'd put up even money now with Casey at the bat. But Flynn preceded Casey, as did also Jimmy Blake, and the former was a pudding and the latter was a fake. So upon that stricken multitude, grim melancholy sat, for there seemed but little chance of Casey's getting to the bat. But Flynn let drive a single to the wonderment of all, and Blake, the much despised, tore the cover off the ball. And when the dust had lifted and they saw what had occurred, there was Jimmy safe on second, and Flynn a hugging third. Now from this gladdened multitude went up a joyous yell. It bounded from the mountain top and rattled from the dell. It struck upon the hillside and recoiled upon the flat. For Casey, mighty Casey, was advancing to the bat. There was ease in Casey's manner as he stepped into his place. There was pride in Casey's bearing and a smile on Casey's face. And one responding to the cheers, he lightly doffed his hat. No stranger in the crowd could doubt 'twas Casey at the bat. 10,000 eyes were on him as he rubbed his hands with dirt. 5,000 tongues applauded while he wiped them on his shirt. Then while the wreathing pitcher ground the ball into his hip, defiance gleamed in Casey's eye. A sneer curled Casey's lip. And now the leather-covered sphere came hurtling through the air, and Casey stood a-watching it in haughty grandeur there. Close by that sturdy batsman, the ball unheeded sped. That ain't my style, said Casey. Strike one, the umpire said. From the benches, black with people, there went up a muffled roar like the beating of the storm waves on a stern and distant shore. Kill him, kill the umpire, shouted someone on the stand. And it's likely they'd have killed him had not Casey raised his hand. With a smile of Christian charity, great Casey's visage shone. He stilled the rising tumult. He bade the game go on. He signaled to that pitcher, and once more the spheroid flew. But Casey still ignored it. And the umpire said, strike two. Fraud, cried the maddened thousands, and the echo answered, fraud. But a scornful look from Casey, and that audience was awed. They saw his face grow stern and cold. They saw his muscles strain, and they knew that Casey would not let that ball go by again. The sneer is gone from Casey's lips. His teeth are clenched in hate. He pounds with cruel violence his bat upon the plate. And now the pitcher holds the ball, and now he lets it go. And now the air is shattered by the force of Casey's blow. Oh, somewhere in this favored land, the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. And somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out. Okay. Now, many of you probably have played sports. So, that's the story of Casey at the bat. Obviously, the hero, you want him to be the hero of the game, and he struck out, okay? But many of you have probably played sports and gotten to that situation where you want to be, where all the pressure in the world is on you to come through, to do what you can do to win the game, okay? We've all been there, Unfortunately for many of us, what that results in is failure, as it did for Casey. But what we're doing here is capturing all the emotion of an incredibly emotional game, baseball, okay? And Casey gets in that situation, and what does he do? He strikes out, okay? So, small town baseball, the whole town is there. They lose the game, so people go home with their heads down, okay? It's like, the Bills playing Kansas City in the playoffs. So anyway, that's an example of a narrative poem. It's a poem that tells a story. Does it move your emotions? Somewhat, sure. You're with Casey as he's going up to bat. You're with the crowd that's there, all that kind of thing. But It basically tells a story. That's a narrative poem. Okay. Another narrative poem that all of you are familiar with is The Night Before Christmas. Okay. And we're running a little bit short of time. So I was going to recite it for you, but really I think I spent a little bit too much time beforehand, so I'm not going to recite that poem for you. But we all know The Night Before Christmas. And again, if you're not, you haven't heard it for a number of months, 'twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, with vision of sugar plums danced in their heads. The mom in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled down for a long winter's nap when out on the lawn there arose such a clatter. I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. And you all know the story, okay? And Santa comes in, and his eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry, his cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry, his droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his face was as white as the snow. All that. And of course, you all know how the story goes, and Santa eventually fills all the stockings and turns with a jerk, and giving a nod up the chimney, he rose and away to the sleigh. You know the story, okay? That's a narrative poem. It's a narrative poem that you're all familiar with, okay? So you have some knowledge of narrative poems. You may have even more knowledge than that. But 'Twas the Night Before Christmas is obviously a really well-known narrative poem, okay? And another one, how are we doing on time here? Let's see. The Cremation of Sam McGee. There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The northern lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake Labarge. I cremated Sam McGee. Now, Sam McGee was from Tennessee, where the cotton blooms and blows. Why he left his home down the south to roam around the pole, God only knows. Anyway, this is a story. We read the story of the man who froze to death in Alaska, or in the Yukon. The Jack London story, correct? The name isn't popping into my head. But The Cremation of Sam McGee is a poem that's all about two guys that have gone to the Yukon Territory to look for gold. Okay, and so The Cremation of Sam McGee, and you can Google it because it's not in your book, but you can just Google The Cremation of Sam McGee, McGee, and read that poem. And again, I could recite the whole thing for you, but it really is 5 or 6 minutes long. So that's okay, because we're already 16 minutes into this video, and I don't like them to be too long. But in the second hand, Sam McGee freezes to death. Okay, and so our narrator is stuck with this frozen body, but he had promised Sam McGee that he would cremate his body. So he finally, after dragging around this body for a number of days, almost going crazy himself and such, having him lashed to the sleigh, he finds an empty old ship with a big coal oven, and so he tears planks from the floor and coal, shoves it in the oven, builds a big fire, and stuffs in Sam McGee, and then goes out, and he tells us he didn't like to hear him sizzle, so he got out of there, and he didn't know how long in the snow he wrestled with grisly fear. But anyway, eventually he goes back in, and he opens the door, and there sat Sam, looking cool and calm in the heart of the furnace roar. And he wore a smile, you could see a mile, and he said, "Please close that door. It's warm in here, but I bravely fear you'll let in the cold and storm. Since I left Plum Tree down in Tennessee, it's the first time I've been warm. There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The northern lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake Labarge. I cremated Sam McGee." Okay, so I've given you 3 narrative poems here, and again, it's a neat story. The Cremation of Sam McGee is a fun story. For the sake of time, I don't want to make this video, 25 minutes long, because you're all busy people too. So we've talked about Casey at the bat, and I recited that for you. Night Before Christmas, I only touched upon little pieces of it, because you all know that poem anyway. And then The Cremation of Sam McGee, okay? And you can check that one out. I'm going to list some other poems in your assignment, some other narrative poems. So this week we're just talking about poems that tell a story. Next week we'll talk about lyric poems, and we'll talk about the fact that there are lyric poems that also tell a story, so poems can be both. But that's not what we're worried about right now. We're talking about getting you comfortable with reading poems. And after Casey at the Bat and The Night Before Christmas and The Cremation of Sam McGee, the stories that go with those and such, it should help you make you a lot more comfortable with the whole concept of poetry. Okay, so don't be afraid of it. Okay, and you know where to get me. Okay, talk to you soon.